Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression, which is sponsoring today's event. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am welcoming you is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed by multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. This is the third in the Center for Free Expression's weekly virtual forum series. The title for today's event is Who is Free to Speak of Genocide? Perspectives on Reclaiming Power and Place, the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. I also want to thank our co-sponsor for today's panel, PEN Canada. I'd like briefly, for the audience, to go over a few things that you need to know for today's discussion. First, you will see the panelists and the moderator once they are introduced. After about 45 minutes or so, the moderator will turn to the audience for questions. So you're free to ask questions that will get addressed by the panel in the final half of the program. To ask a question, look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. You click on that and you can write out a question anytime. Now your question will only be visible to you and to Ange Holmes, who's the center's coordinator and who will be presenting your questions to the panel when we get to that section. But you can ask your questions as they come up anytime during the discussion of the panel. Do not use the chat function. The chat button, which is next to the Q&A button, is disabled for this in this version of the Zoom software. The whole session is being recorded, and a video recording of it will be posted tomorrow on the Center for Free Expression website. And that website is cfe.ryerson.ca, cfe.ryerson.ca. And you can find it either under events, where you'll see the poster for today's event and the link to the podcast, or you can go under podcasts on the site and you'll find it there as well. I'd like to express my appreciation to Ange Holmes, our coordinator, who does so much of the work that makes these panels possible. I also want to thank Brian Bowes and Luke Nader from Ryerson's Media Services, whose technical expertise has and continues to be invaluable. And finally, I'd like to advise you that the next panel in our series, titled Has Our Fear of Offending Gone Too Far, will be next Thursday, a week tomorrow, May 28th at 2 p.m. Now, our panel for today. We have quite a remarkable group of panelists, and it's a pleasure to introduce them to you. First is Cyndy Baskin. Cyndy is of Mi'kmaq and Celtic descent, originally from New Brunswick, but has been living in Toronto for many years. Her clan is the Fish, and her spirit name translates something like, I hope I have this right, Cyndy, the woman who passes on teachings. She is currently an associate professor in the School of Social Work at Ryerson University. Her teaching, research, and writing interests involve how Indigenous worldviews can inform education, spirituality, anti-violence approaches toward Indigenous women and girls, mental health, and decolonizing research strategies. Cyndy is the academic coordinator of the Certificate of Aboriginal Knowledge and Experiences at the Chang School of Continuing Education at Ryerson. She is also an author of two novels, a textbook, an edited book on spirituality and social work, and numerous journal articles and book chapters focusing on Indigenous peoples. Prior to joining Ryerson, Cyndy worked as a social worker for many years within Indigenous agencies in Toronto, and has assisted and continues to assist many First Nations communities to set up cultural-based programming. Welcome, Cyndy. Our second panelist is Len Findley. Len is Distinguished University Professor Emeritus and a founding and ongoing member of the Indigenous Humanities Group at the University of Saskatchewan, with Marie Baptiste, Sakej Henderson, and Isabel Findley. He is also a past president of Academy One, Arts and Humanities of the Royal Society of Canada, a two-term chair of the Canadian Association of University Teachers Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee, and a fellow of the Center, a senior fellow of the Center for Free Expression. Trained in 19th century European elite and radical cultural theory and production, his most recent Canadianist work engages with the Indigenous settler interface, historically and currently, the distinctiveness and endangerment of the humanities in Canada, and the connections and tensions between academic freedom and the decolonizing of Canadian universities. Welcome, Len. Our third panelist is Lynn Lavalley. She is an Anishinaabe registered with the Métis Nations of Ontario. She's a professor in the School of Social Work at Ryerson and is strategic lead Indigenous Resurgence in the Faculty of Community Services. She had left Ryerson in 2017 to serve as the University of Manitoba's first vice provost of Indigenous engagement. After a year and a half, she returned to Ryerson to focus on Indigenous resurgence in the Academy, which translated into supporting Indigenous peoples within the colonial academy versus a broad indigenization or reconciliation. Lynn has a BA in kinesiology and psychology, a Master of Science in community health, and a PhD in social work. Her research expertise lies in the areas of Indigenous resurgence, Indigenous research ethics, Indigenous research methodology, and Indigenous health and well-being, particularly related to cultural teachings. Welcome, Lynn. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator who's going to oversee this remarkable panel. Karen Pulisi is best known for her work as a Parliamentary Hill reporter and is the executive director of news and current affairs at the Aboriginal People's Television Network, where she ran the news department for 7 years. Karen joined the Ryerson School of Journalism, a colleague of mine now, in the spring of this year, while completing a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University. Karen has worked in both daily news and long-form investigations at a variety of outlets, including iChannel, Vision TV, CBC, and CTV. Karen is currently the president of the Canadian Association of Journalists and is a board member of the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. She is a journalist for Human Rights Ambassador and has worked as an expert trainer for the program in the South Sudan in 2018. Her journalism has been recognized by many, the Canadian Association of Journalists, Canadian Screen Awards, the Native American Journalists Association, and the Public Policy Forum. She holds degrees in journalism and history. Karen is a citizen of the Pikwakanagan First Nation in Ontario, and is of mixed Algonquin and Italian descent. When she's not engaged in acts of journalism, I'm told you'll find her paddling a canoe, shooting photos, and eating fry bread. So I turn it over to you, Karen, and the panel. Thank you very much. I look forward to an interesting and fascinating conversation.
Thanks so much, Jim. And thank you, Jim and Ange and people for bringing us together today. We'll start out, this is really going to become a conversation between all of us, but we thought we'd start out maybe by just talking about where we're from and maybe some points that I really hope come up in the conversation today. Cyndy, why don't we start out with you? Oh, I think we're having trouble hearing you. Why don't I let you move with your mic, and I'll just go ahead on to Lynn for a second while we see if we can get that fixed.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Bonjour, Anin. Minaduna Bekwe Indishnakas, Wawashkiji and Dodam, Sudbury and Digiba. My name is Lynn Lavalley. I'm Anishinaabe Métis and registered with the Métis Nation of Ontario. My family comes from many areas across Canada. So Temiskaming, Swan Lake, Maniwaki, and the last names include Lavalley, Richard, Gauthier, Pepin, Kea, Kada, McIver, Godin, to name a few. And what I hope we speak about today is, when people speak truth to power, and then they're labeled as shaming and blaming, it actually is a way of silencing, right? And I parallel it with the freedom of speech platform that white supremacists use. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that, because there's a balance with respect to speaking and then also being labeled that you're calling out and shaming and blaming the people who are trying to speak truth to power.
That's actually, I can't wait to get into that part of conversation as a journalist. Cyndy, did we get your mic working?
I have no idea.
Yes, we did. Cyndy,
Okay.
you're with us. Fantastic. So Cyndy, tell us a bit about where you're from and what you hope comes up in the conversation today.
Okay, so I am from the beautiful Mi'kmaq territory, from a very small First Nations community in northern New Brunswick called Eel River Bar. I'm right on the Atlantic Ocean, in my opinion, the most beautiful place in the world. What do I want to come out of today? I think I'm going to fall back on that the personal is political. I want people to be able to understand more about the voices of Indigenous women and our power and our abilities to be leaders, etc. But I also want us to keep in mind that we're also the families, including myself, of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Thank you for that. And we'll go on to Len. Now, Len, of course, where are you from is a very Indigenous phrase. It's what we always say when we greet each other. But you're from somewhere else.
Yes, sometimes I'm from all over the place, but today I'm in Saskatoon, in my home, Treaty 6 territory, in the traditional territory of the Métis. I was born in the north of Scotland, Aberdeen. You can probably still hear that in my voice. I'm sure it will go on with me all the way through my life, my burr. And it marks me in particular kinds of ways as a working class Scot, who first person ever to go to university in my family, came out as a conduit of class rather than race analysis, but went to the belly of the imperial beast in Oxford, survived that, came to Canada. I'm a gopher now, spent all my time, more than 40 years on the prairies, and engaged in learning. And what I'm interested in and have been wrestling with for many years is, why is settler Canada so blind and deaf to the extraordinary accomplishments of Canada's Indigenous peoples historically and currently? Why do they still cling to deficiency narratives dear to the hearts of colonialists, rather than stepping beyond that, looking at what the accomplishments of UNDRIP, looking at the accomplishments of the TRC, looking at the wonderful and pertinent accomplishments of the report of the National Inquiry, and see that Indigenous Canada is all about enrichment. It isn't about deficiency at all.
Thank you for that. So we don't want this conversation to be, just me asking questions one-on-one. So I'm going to throw out some topics, and everybody should just feel free to jump in as they do. But let's go back to something that Lynn had raised, this notion of naming and shaming, because one of the first things that happened, this report came out June last year. And one of the first things that happened is the minute the word genocide came out, people were shamed. It was a huge debate whether or not that word was appropriate, whether or not it should be used. You had editorials saying, how dare you embarrass Canada, and this is not going to help your cause. And while I don't believe it's necessarily on purpose, there's certainly been a lot less coverage of missing and murdered Indigenous women since. Lynn, did you want to jump in and just kind of lead that part of the conversation?
Yeah, sure. This came to me really from a personal thing that I was involved with when I called something out and ended up shutting down something related to George Eliot Clark. But with respect to the shaming of Canada, so we're shaming Canada if we're actually speaking truth to power with respect to the national report on missing murdered Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit and trans. But that report talks about systemic colonial violence being the foundation of gender-based genocide. And, you know, people really got hung up entertaining the discussion about genocide, which ended up being a diversion and continued to silence and erase Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit and trans. And, you know, if you look at the National Inquiry or National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's website, they actually have a 46-page legal analysis of the term genocide that was used. So to continue the conversation about whether this is genocide or not is simply a diversion.
They literally, if you, like, I did a word cloud of some of those editorials, and, you know, just to see how frequently words are used, and women, you could see the women just literally shut out of the conversation. Any thoughts, Len, Cyndy?
Yeah, I think women are shut out, right? Like, I'm going to jump right into George Eliot Clark because we're talking about who can speak about genocide. And, you know, when he came out and he was going to profile the murder of Pamela George.
Maybe just give a, sorry,
Yeah.
could you just give a little bit of background in case people don't
Sure.
recognize the name?
Sure. Pamela George was murdered in 1996, I believe. It might have been 94, 95, 96, and by two people. And one of them, they served less than 7 years in jail. One of them changed his name, moved south, and became a poet. And George Eliot Clark, who is a professor at the University of Toronto, was going to be speaking at the University of Regina in I think it was 2020. It seems so long ago, but it was just a few months ago. And word got out that he was going to read from the poetry of this murderer. And, you know, we reacted all across Canada, and we weren't able to shut him down until he feared his progress in with poetry, and, you know, with his publishers coming down on him. And the universities also stood behind George Eliot Clark with this being freedom of speech, freedom of expression, right? I wrote the president directly and said, why are you allowing this to happen? They got back to me and said, I'm really sorry, it's freedom of speech, but he won't read the poetry. And then right after that, that's when he withdrew, right? So he wasn't shut down by the university. He wasn't even shut down by the movement across Canada. So, you know, and I remember tweeting, and then I have a pinned tweet now that says, you know, when we speak truth to power and we're called out and we're saying that we shamed and blamed George Eliot Clark, poor George Eliot Clark, that's a diversion to the conversation. And that happens often. And it really reminds me of the platform of white supremacy that uses freedom of speech to further hate propaganda. Is that enough of the background, or did you want to add, Karen?
No, I think that's great. Thank you so much. Cyndy, Len, did you have any thoughts?
I agree with Lynn around the whole thing about all the focus on genocide. You know, the TRC spoke about cultural genocide that was caused by the residential school system. So I find it very interesting that why can't the National Inquiry also speak of genocide when it comes to the disappearing and murdered of women, girls, Two-Spirit and trans women? The reality is that genocide and colonization go together. And this has been happening since the beginning of colonization, right? There have always been genocidal practices, and some have been very specific towards Indigenous women. You know, all the way from the smallpox-infested blankets to over-incarceration of Indigenous women, sterilizations of Indigenous women, the child welfare system, the trafficked, the disappeared, and the murdered. The other thing, too, that I want to say about this is that we have also been silenced over and over again by this thing called the Indian Act, right? It's 140 years since this act came about, and we are still being excluded of so-called Indian status. But more importantly, we're being excluded from membership in our communities and participating in leadership and governance of their First Nations, right? So for me, it's about, if you want to make Indigenous cultures disappear, which is what's been happening since the beginning of colonization, then Indigenous women need to disappear, because we're the ones who bring life into this world, and we pass on the values and the teachings, right? Plus, and I think this is critical to what's happening throughout this country right now, the only way in which Indigenous peoples can be permanently severed from our land is when we no longer exist as people. No women, no land, no people. That certainly sounds like genocide to me. So let's start talking about the really important stuff.
I think you just raised so many like really great points there. I was thinking as you were talking about women, an elder telling me that if you want to break the heart of a nation, you break the heart of its women, you know, and really, you know, I think a lot of the inquiry was really, when they were talking about genocide, getting into the history and the legal history of how we got from that to here today. But you also said something else really interesting about the TRC, because it's true. The TRC came out and said that there had been a cultural genocide. And that actually didn't get the same kind of pushback as the National Inquiry did. I'm just wondering if you or anybody has any thoughts on, was it because it was women saying it, or was it because they said genocide and not cultural genocide?
It could be because the TRC said cultural genocide as opposed to genocide, but I'm more inclined to think that it's about silencing Indigenous women. I think that that is the number one thing that this is really all about, to shut us down and make us voiceless.
For me, what's happened is the current operations of the ancient misogyny machine. Aristotle said nothing becomes a woman better than her silence. Know your place, zip your lip, act as the patriarchy dictates. In the current situation, I think that the two main sources of resistance to the employment of the term genocide in the report were mainstream media protecting Canada's illusions about itself as a poster democracy, an honest broker, multilateralist middle power, not the United States, all of those kinds of ways in which people reassure themselves about a certain fictitious version of this country. The Academy, on the other hand, people like Donald Smith and Jim Miller, for example, were defending their reputations and defending their claim that genocide is the wrong word. So there's academic patriarchy expressed as turf protection. There is the reticence and timidity of the mainstream media that word is so toxic that it can't be employed at all. And it's very interesting that cultural genocide, if it had been said cultural genocide, Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin had employed the expression cultural genocide, the TRC had employed it, but the employment of it seemed to detoxify it, to remove the real political and ethical challenge and accusation that is at the heart of that word. And so to use it, and of course it assumes that cultural genocide is a lesser thing, and we'll get to this later, I hope, that in Lemkin's work for the original UN Convention, cultural genocide was seen not as a lesser marginal thing. It was seen as a core value and trigger of the big G genocide. So cultural genocide can be read rigorously and robustly, or it can be read in a way that it goes into the national alibi factory that keeps on conjuring reasons why a woman should be quiet and not broach embarrassing topics.
And it's interesting too, the way I find that, like we're talking about misogyny coming in, but it also comes into our communities as well, and a limitation of discussion in our communities. There's some dark places where democracy no longer exists, really growing out of colonialism. But I mean, I know in terms of shutting down women, even my female reporters, there are chiefs and people who work for chiefs who've literally treated my reporters like squeeze toys. They have no problems putting their hands on them, harming them, and yet they will sit there and say, oh, well, you know, we support women, we supported this inquiry, and they speak the language, but their actions are quite different. And if that's what they're doing when the cameras are rolling and the lights are on, what are they doing the rest of the time? So I kind of put it out there in ways that I think, Lynn, you talked about women being shut down. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, you know, I'm going to go to another point that you just said first, but you know, when people talk about misogyny, one of the first signs of misogyny is someone saying, "But I love women," right? It's that defending thing. And I remember an occasion where an Indigenous male mansplained misogyny to me and said, "Do you know what misogyny is? I love women," right? So I just want people to recognize that that's a red flag when people say they love women, when they're, you know, being spoken to about misogyny. And I think the silencing piece is challenging, right? Because there's silencing that society does, there's silencing that individuals do to individuals. There's silencing that we do to ourselves because of our fear, right? But the reality is, the systemic violence that occurs on Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and trans is real, right? We have a reason to be fearful, right? It's not made up. But on the same token, what does it mean for someone to think, well, if I kill this person, it's not going to matter, right? Indigenous women don't matter. Indigenous people don't matter. So if I kill an Indigenous woman, I'll get away with it, right? So there's the two sides of that. There's the silencing of ourselves because, you know, of the environment that we're in, as well as the silencing that happens by society. But the reality is, it's the systemic colonial violence that is at the foundation of gender-based violence.
And I see you nodding, Len.
Yeah, and I think that one point I would add is that this was, the word genocide didn't slip into a footnote in this report. The word occurs in your face, up front, without apology. It occurs regularly in the multiple voices in the report. It occurs in the wonderful artwork, the legacy archive that represents material cultural expressions of what was heard in the voices in the report, and in the supplement. That is the quality, and this gets me back to the resistance to female accomplishment and Indigenous female accomplishment as a double whammy, that people should self-censor and know their place. That is that the quality of the work in the report is overwhelmingly superior to the cheap shots in academic and review literature and the crippling timidity of the mainstream media. All that they earn in that report over and over and over again the right to use the G word. And that makes the report and those who support it especially unforgivable.
And Cyndy, you looked like you wanted to say something.
I think I'll pick up a little bit on what Lynn actually just said, because again, picking up on the genocide piece, but the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and it describes genocide in a number of different ways. So it talks about killing members of a national, racial, or ethnic group, causing serious bodily harm, creating conditions to bring about the destruction of a group, preventing births, and the forced removal of children, which I've mentioned in the first time that I spoke, right? The state actually only needs one of these acts in order to be guilty of the crime of genocide. Well, Canada is guilty on all these fronts when it comes to Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and trans women. So it's actually, personally to me, mind-boggling that we're pretending that this is not what's happening.
You know, and I think by invoking the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you get like to that point, whether it's reconciliation, whether it's dealing with genocide, whether it's, I mean, we hear this so frequently. The residential schools couldn't have been all that bad. You learned to read to write, didn't you? And there's this, you know, as Len has pointed out, this constant denial. Have we even gotten to truth? No.
Nope. Yeah.
And you know, it's funny because we laugh, and maybe for people who like are from outside of our communities, Indigenous people, we have this tendency to use humor and to laugh. So sometimes we'll get into conversations that are actually very serious, but you'll see us smiling. We just have this different way of expressing ourselves. I sometimes feel like I need to explain that. You know, how do you solve this problem? I mean, this is really at the core, I think, of the question about who gets to speak about genocide and whether or not you're going to ever get ahead on solving these problems. You have to recognize the problems are there in the first place. How do we break through this?
I think for me, I think about the next generation and I think small, right? I can't change the university. I can't change certain people's minds, even though facts are, you know, displayed. But for me, it's about the next generation. And I want my niece and my nephews and my grandnephews to recognize their value as human beings, right? As Anishinaabe people. I want them to recognize their Indigenous identity, right? Because identity being removed from us actually contributes to our ill health, right? So for me, it's about that next generation. And that's my gauge, right? If I'm doing things, how is this going to impact the next generation? How is this going to impact my niece? Because too many people have died, right? Too many people have died. And, you know, I can simply focus on that. And, you know, when it comes to, you know, you give someone a little bit of information, and when you see them take that information and then they share it more broadly, that is absolutely amazing, right? So I remember the first time it happened with my niece and my nephew, right? Just sharing some information, and my niece started working at Anishinaabe Health and, you know, started to do ceremony, and just knowing that that's going to make the difference with the next generation. I firmly believe that. Like, and I think that, yes, we need to do things that have an impact more broadly. But at times, especially when our lives are under threat, we sometimes focus in a little bit more. We funnel a little bit more for Indigenous people. And I think that's where non-Indigenous people can step up, right? When we need to take that break.
Cyndy?
Once again, I'm going to agree with what Lynn said about the next generation. And I think I've got sort of 2 points that I'd like to make about that. I'm a firm believer in education. That's why I ended up in doing what I'm doing. And I have a lot of hope, right? As I've been there for several years, I have a lot of hope that we're making headway. I think that young people do want to hear more of the truth, that they are more interested in being allies, and etc. And I think that's really critical. And yeah, they do still need the truth. When people are coming into university and for the first time hearing about what colonization has done to Indigenous people, well, there's another shame on our country if there ever was one. But that's changing. So I think that that's one of the things that I really believe in. The other thing is that, you know, I'm thinking of my youngest son, who is in university, and he's doing public administration and Indigenous governance. And he said to me when he was first starting out in terms of what he was going to choose to study, he said, you know, you and my dad, you raised me with the culture and you raised me with the spirituality, and I've got a good base and I'm really appreciative about that. But you know what, Mom? Culture and spirituality doesn't take away poverty. right? What we need to do is to
Mhm.
focus on that, to make systemic kinds of changes where we eliminate poverty. And I really like that. I think it's like taking the work that I've tried to do and bringing it to a whole other level.
And you know, like, something you said like really resonated with me. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was happening, originally, I mean, I understood it to be very specifically about residential school survivors. This was for them. And it was important. Like, there are veterans. They went out and they paid with their childhood and with their bodies in some cases. And, you know, went through pure hell because of the schools, there's no doubt. But then, you know, like when the Truth and Reconciliation report came out, it was so much broader and so much beyond the mandate that it was supposed to have. It had been given that tiny mandate by the Harper government, and they really came out with a Royal Commission-sized report. And I think in my Aboriginal bubble, living at APTN, I now understood reconciliation to be fundamental change, a remaking of Canada, where our people would finally fit into it. And that was sort of like the big promise of the TRC, regardless of what governments say. And so there's a lot of pressure on us, but we need that cooperation from Canada. Whereas I think most Canadians understood Truth and Reconciliation to be a small r reconciliation. As I came out of my bubble at APTN and went out into the world, I realized we weren't speaking the same language. We didn't have the same definition of reconciliation. Len, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd start with the education piece, which is always foregrounded. I mean, Sagish Henderson talks about Indigenous cultures as teaching civilizations. That is, teaching is there in the relationship between families and children. And so I always say, speak truth to power, but speak youth to power. So how do we empower youth voices? I think we do so in two ways. We do so as educators. Educators have the privilege of productive intimacy with their students. They can invite them into their office. They can have a coffee with them. They can say, this is important in your work. Your voice matters. Here is how you can more effectively exercise it, not only in this course, but in life beyond the university. But we also have curricula, which are colonial and neo-colonial in absolutely indefensible ways. So the Academy, the Canadian Academy, which should be looked to in its relationship to youth to produce that next generation, which will do the deep transformation that has been identified over and over again as necessary and achievable, if you put the poverty word in there as well and address the underlying conditions in society. So that for me, the education is crucial. But education is often about performing in different languages in the same classroom or this. You're not speaking the same language. You are, but you aren't. And it's finding the forms of evidence, the forms, what language do you employ? If you think for a minute about the TRC and the National Inquiry Report, both of these were produced by passing and refusing. Both were written they came out in both official languages. They're using written text. They're not using a story or a song or a drum dance in order to communicate their message. They're speaking the language, they're employing the media and the genre of the dominant. But they're also saying we are doing that not to pass and be assimilated by you, but to try and get you to understand our difference as your enrichment, rather than our difference as your problem that you need to solve under the heading of the so-called Indian problem. So for me, I think that everything is there already, but receptivity. You know, Justice McEachran in the BC court saying, no singing in my court. And after all, I have a 10-ear. Well, he was speaking for millions of Canadians when he said he had a 10-ear. Learning to listen and listening to learn are crucial features of any educational system. But as we know from our students, some are educable and some are more difficult to reach, and some obviously live in outer space. But nonetheless, we have to keep trying. The evidence is there, the urgency is there, the opportunities for transformation are there, but people need things translated into the language that will both, yes, challenge them, but also encourage them to take negativity and make creativity out of it.
That's a nice thought. Lynn? Did you?
I kind of forgot the question, but I know where I wanted to go when you originally spoke. When you talk about the report, you know, encompassing everything, and, you know, it made me think about when people say, you need to stay in your lane. That's also another form of silencing, right? And when I look at everything with respect to the National Inquiry, I think they did stay in that lane, but that lane is a really big lane because it's systemic colonial violence, right? So I think everything in there is completely relevant. You know, same thing with the TRC. There's over 5,000 pages of material, right? And there's so much even more, like with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. There's, you know, I wouldn't just say data, but there's information, like they're putting calls out to people to do research, community to do research with some of the information to dive a bit deeper than the TRC already dived into, right? So with the National Inquiry, there's a lot of information there, but you know, we can't stay in that lane, right? And this lane is huge because it's systemic colonial violence.
Cyndy, you have thoughts?
It's all, exactly, it's all connected, it's all related, right? We can't really do one thing or focus on one specific thing without all the others. They're all connected. And it is those systemic issues that we have to be looking at. Yeah, we're all doing our, you know, smaller parts, but it's very clear that if we don't end up at a place where there's true change at that level, then things are not going to change.
You know, and I think that when you mentioned that, like I think people kind of expected this report to be the missing murdered Indigenous women, this inquiry, to really just be focused very much on the present. I think that's a really good point that they did go back and they did show there is history here, and it's one thing after the other that has led to the creation of the situation in which women today find themselves unsafe, and more unsafe than women in other ethnic groups in other parts of Canada. And there are very specific reasons for it. And I know Len talked a lot about history and, you know, needing youth to step up. But I feel that there's like a frustration among some of our youth that worries me. We talked a little bit about this before, about this reconciliation is dead kind of meme. And then, you know, if reconciliation's dead, where does that leave us? Do we all go home, or is it a civil war? And I just, you know, I just wonder, is there some point where, you know, Canada hits the last generation? Could I be the last generation of Indigenous people that the government can bargain with? At what point, you know, at what point does we say the progress has been too slow? And it's just not, you know, like we're just not willing to negotiate anymore.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that, I know I often hear from different folks about how, I don't know if it's disappointment or whatever, but just not speaking very positively about our young people. Frankly, I'm sick to death of hearing all about the suicides, which is like a really convoluted situation. Like there's so much false information around youth suicide. There's so much false information about alcohol and other substance use for Indigenous peoples. It's really, really annoying to me that these things still continue to be spoken of as though they're the truth everywhere. And I think, I guess it comes from my place of hope that I mentioned earlier. I just think that this next generation of Indigenous youth are doing things their way, right? They're doing things their way. And that's what they ought to be doing, right? We've given them and continue to give them what we have and what we can, but it's up to them to pick things up the other way. Frankly, I don't think they're going to put up with this bleep much longer.
And Len, you looked like you wanted to say something there.
It was very evident for me during the Wet'suwet'en, and when the blockades went up and youth were entering the public domain in ways that were critical, informed, and suggesting, show us a future that we can look forward to. Now that shows that the capacities are there, the triggers happen from time to time, but the reality is, if I can think of 4 key student mentors I had as a teacher when I came to Canada, and what they did for me. These are graduate students, and I was on their committees. The first committee I was on was Maria Campbell's. Now, Maria Campbell was far more distinguished than most of the university, and certainly the whole of the committee in which I was sitting. I watched her try to negotiate the academic labyrinth in order to affirm herself and to take her knowledge in a way that she thought was most beneficial. She eventually withdrew from the program. The second committee I was on was Willie Ermine, and Willie was doing an MA in I was introduced to the aristocracy right there. And Willie and Marie Baptiste, who was supervising Willie, said, could you be on the committee in order to, educate some of my colleagues on the committee into recognizing the power of this work about ethical spaces. Willie got through and went on to work at First Nations and be the kind of wonderful presence he is. Laurie Blondeau, who was a performance artist and curator, runs Tribe Consortium. She got the University Prize for the best master's thesis. She then said, well, on to the PhD. I'm into serious decolonizing here, and I'm on a roll. So she then went into the PhD, interdisciplinary PhD. She got blocked, dismissed, patronized so long that eventually she withdrew. And so the Academy was once again recognizing brilliance, terrified by Indigenous brilliance, and trying to dissipate it and push Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous creativity to the margins again. The last of these student mentors is Tasha Hubbard, who I taught as an undergraduate. I supervised her master's thesis at the beginning of her Buffalo project. I helped her when she was her first documentary on Starlight Tours through all of this. And she, of the 4, all with incredibly gifted, was the one who is most able, because of her relative youth, to manage the new mediascape, to use documentary film, to use social media, to employ. So I think that there is not only the continuity of the need for change, but there is a growing capacity, as in the Idle No More movement, to use social media for ethical, for politically transformative purposes. So I like Cyndy, I hope, but the evidence for that hope is getting people into the Academy who have the knowledge, the community connections, and the courage, because it takes courage to make the inroads, to empower the voices, to secure the change we all want.
And Lynn, what do you think about what we're hearing here?
I just want to say Laurie's at the University of Manitoba now. in a tenure track position. Yay!
Mhm.
Yeah. You know, when I think about reconciliation is dead, right? I use hashtag reconciliation fail. And, you know, it's not that I lack hope, right? It's about, can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
Not that I lack hope. It's about, you know, a reality that we're in, right? And I think our youth, or I shouldn't say our youth, not possessive, but youth are really, you know, picking things up. And when I speak, the reason why I don't like to talk now about reconciliation or indigenization or decolonization is because I think we have to admit that we're in colonial institutions, right? The government is a colonial government, right? Lynn Lavalley, am not going to change that. What I can do, though, as a person in the academy, is to assist Indigenous students, right? So I want to resist reconciliation, decolonization, and indigenization that supports non-Indigenous people in academia, and I want to focus on Indigenous resurgence. So for me, Indigenous resurgence is about us becoming healthier, right? It's about us supporting each other. It's about us, you know, Vern Harper used to talk about the fact that we've been defeathered, and Emma LaRocque wrote a book, Defeathering the Indian, in 1975. Before I left the University of Manitoba, we brought her in to speak, and she spoke about that book, saying much hasn't changed. That book focused on anti-Indigenous racism for students in post-secondary. And she goes, not much has changed except for the numbers, right? So Indigenous resurgence is about us gathering those feathers. It's about reconnecting with ceremony, reconnecting with culture. It's about the humor, right? The humor right now with COVID, like everybody's going Facebook Live with everything, right? So, you know, you just gotta laugh, right? So, you know, that for me is the focus. So it's not that I'm you know, I lack hope, or, you know, I'm not in favor of reconciliation. I don't think it can happen, but you know, I want to focus on Indigenous resurgence. I want to focus on supporting the youth, focus on ceremony, right? Because I think that, especially in the academy, when we are focused on indigenizing, right? So you talk about, you know, infusing curriculum across the entire campus. That's going to help a lot of people learn about Indigenous people, which is great. What happens to the Indigenous learner in the classroom, right? So what I want to do is I want to take a mirror and I want to focus on supporting Indigenous people with Indigenous resurgence, right? So when it comes to this report, the National Inquiry Report, when it comes to the TRC, there's so much material for people to read. So now when people ask me, Lynn, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? Well, go read these 5,000 pages and then come back to me and we can have a conversation, right? I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it has to stop with respect to that falling on the shoulders of Indigenous people, particularly in the realm of the academy.
Yeah, and I think, you know, going back to what I said, I like your word resurgence, because to me that was really how I understood reconciliation was supposed to be. It was supposed to be this remaking of our area, and it seems to have gotten knocked down to like some sort of government program or something. But you know, it's been a year since the MMIW report came out, and it's been awfully quiet since. I don't know if anybody, you know, we're probably going to wrap up shortly and start taking questions, but what's happened? There's supposed to be follow-up. It's probably been delayed. I saw an article out of APTN by Kathleen Martins that COVID has delayed a response to the MMIW inquiry, but why is it taking so long, and why have we heard nothing?
Mm-hmm. Well, Carolyn Bennett said that something's coming. That was kind of
right.
It just seems like a big report, a big conversation of you use the G word, and then silence.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where we're at.
So the notion of like RCAP, brilliant archive of knowledge, of potential solutions, of emergent agendas, and RCAP was allowed to gather dust. The idea, oblivion is the instrument of the dominant. That is to say, okay, there's this little flare up and then it's gone. And we we rely on the self-serving amnesia of the general population in Canada to move it to the back burner whenever, as soon as possible. And so for me, I recognize, I've just been reading the collection that John Burroughs and Michael Ash put together on resurgence. I think resurgence is a good word. I don't think we should lose the word insurgency as well, because around the blockades, and this goes back to the point of when does an oppressed cohort lose its patience and be inaccessible to mediation and to conversation and to dialogue. And I think, Karen, you posed the question very well, and it's so timely. That is to say, which do you prefer? Do you prefer the talking cure? Do you prefer respectful dialogue? Well, where's your respect? Or do you want to deal with the kinds of consequences that will be predictable, that may appeal to you because it allows you to blame the victim once again, but you have to take this seriously.
And Len, like when you use the term resurgence, it's bad enough. Insurgents, oh my gosh, right? I think the younger generation, the youth, that's where they're headed, right? People are, Scoden, Studis, Caden, right? Like that's what it's about.
And so is there anything that we've missed in this conversation that we should be talking about?
So much more.
Go for it. Now's your time.
No, I think there's so much more. And I think that if we were going to have a panel like this again, right? I'm not that young. I think we're lacking a younger voice, right? And one of the things that I know is when we approach things, and I think youth look up to us at times, but we also get things wrong, right? And from their perspective, but also in reality, right? And I think that it's important to have that youth voice. So maybe in the future, if this happens, we could bring that forward. There's so many amazing youth across Canada, working on different initiatives in Indigenous resurgence and Wet'suwet'en territory. So that might be something to think about.
And you know what, Lynn, first of all, thank you for reminding me that I'm old. Thank you.
I don't know how old you are. That's why I said I'm old.
But that is like a really important point, because I've seen, especially when we bring young reporters into the newsroom, and now that I'm working with students, just that there is a different worldview. And it's different than mine. And there's times where you kind of say, well, I think I need to step aside and let them lead. And I appreciate that that comment. I think it's an important one. Cyndy?
Oh, it just reminded me of somebody. I'm just looking, I'm looking forward to the day when I can just kind of sit back in my big chair and be this mentor. And that's it. And let the youth just go with it and take over everything. I am so looking forward to that day. I get tired and old.
Yeah.
Well, put me first before that day. I'm an emeritus professor, not a decrepitous professor, and I'm going out swinging. But what the principle I would adhere to is nothing about us without us. And so therefore the idea that the politics that will save us will be a really creative intergenerational politics. And that, I think, is there. The possibilities are all around us. And teachers and the older generation, I don't include you in that, Karen, but in the older generation, that we will hear things. And we should expect to hear things that we don't like, as well as things that we never dreamt of, that never occurred to us. But if we are having a teaching paradigm, if there is a kind of national pedagogy that can change Canada into a self-educating, collectively inclusive and just society, rather than Harold Cardinal's rejoinder to Trudeau of the unjust society. If we can get in that direction, that means I agree getting out of the way, but I would prefer to be asked to sit down and shut up rather than stampeded over because I'm so much in the way of the future.
Okay, so we do have some questions from the audience. So I'm going to go to this one. It's from Francine Joe, who says, sadly, we live in a country whose laws and institutions perpetuate violations of basic human and Indigenous rights. RCAP TRC and MMIWG final report might raise upsetting conclusions for non-Indigenous Canadians, but it's our truth and our history. How do we educate Canadians that Indigenous people are not treated equally to others, and the stereotypes are in part due to this harmful colonial history? Do we focus on youth? And will we get the necessary resources and personnel? Anybody want to jump in and take that one on?
That's a huge question, right? And I don't, like, you know, maybe Cyndy, since you have the hope, you can address this in but I seriously, you know, when we live in our bubbles in the academy, right, that's one thing, right? But the reality is when I walk on the street where my niece lives, right, who are we really? And how do you change that, right? And that's when I really try to focus, and I get more focused on, you know, it really comes down to safety, right? When you're feeling unsafe, you really focus on yourself and your family and your community. And I really don't have faith in the government with this. I don't have faith in Carolyn Bennett. I'm sorry, Carolyn. I do not have faith in Justin Trudeau. You know, so that's where I am at right now. Hopefully the next generation can be in a different position. I really think that we have to, you know, I think about Vern Harper, who talked about being dissident, right? And I think we have to challenge government whenever we can. I also think we have to be respectful of for people who are in the front line doing that work, and not criticize those people, because collectively we move forward. Some people are moving. Can you hear that drilling?
I can hear a bit of drilling in the background. It's not bothering anybody. Like, we can still hear you clearly, but we'll just identify it if people are listening and they're wondering what the noise is. There's construction going on.
It's COVID, working from home, right? But I think that there's some people who are on that front line, right? And they're taking the shots, right? They're taking the shots every single day. And the worst thing is when our own community members are saying, oh, look at that person, they want the limelight. Oh, look at that person, like Lynn Lavalley at the University of Manitoba. I've seen people cringe when I mention certain individual names who are doing that advocacy work, who are doing that activism, right? And we are that collective. So there's some people who, you know, put their head down, they're not, you know, pushing those boundaries, but they're working with community and they're helping community, but we are a collective. And that person who is at the front line taking those shots, sometimes they need to step back, right? So in cycling, you have the first person cycling is breaking the wind, right? Going, but you move back and forth. Someone else takes that lead, right? And our youth are now taking that lead, and we have to support the youth.
And then Cyndy, did you want to jump in with a thought?
Education happens within the academy, within schools, yes. But education happens in so many other ways. Like social media was brought up, and our young people are, you know, experts at that, and that's a great way to be able to do it. Journalism, right? Karen, like being able that are our truth, right? And blowing away the kind of myths and stereotypes. I think that that's also very important to education. And it's kind of like, you know, you tell one person and then it gets to another, to another, to another. So yeah, just looking at many different ways of how we educate people. Are we going to get the resources that we need, was the other part of that question. Nobody gives you power. You take it. I think I'll leave it at that.
And you know, just I feel like APTN did have a lot of influence on changing some concepts in media, opening things up. I think it came onto the scene and no one was really sure what it was going to be. But as they proved that they were doing solid journalism and they were finding these stories and leading these stories, it did kind of change things a bit. But I will say this, I mean, there was a nice reading of like these different things I've been able to do as an Indigenous woman journalist. And if we hadn't had our own media, I never would have made it in a career. I would have graduated and I'd probably be typing somewhere in a back room. So we do have to make our own things. Len, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Well, I think that there's the mobilizing the community, and then there's the function of role models. When Cyndy Blackstock got an honorary degree from the University of Saskatchewan, I was sitting in the front row at convocation, and she addressed the graduating class and the parents there.
Cyndy's fantastic.
And she was absolutely riveting. Speak about speaking truth to power. And the audience were in the palm of her hand by the end. That is, that people, and they were all excited, looking to the future. They were probably fearing some rehearsal of stale truths in some sort of valetudinarian kind of speech. Instead, they got it straight from the heart and straight to the heart of the matter. And I think that there are many, many artists and academics and leaders in Canada, Indigenous leaders in Canada, who are spellbinding. They're far more interesting than so much of the white bread culture that's out there that passes as entertainment and information. They are where the reimagining of the country is. Indian country is where the action is, and not in the travestied, demonized, and dismissive versions of it, but in, and that's why APTN has been so important as a lesson. You need your own platforms, you need your own voices, otherwise people will too readily disfigure, ignore, or dismiss your message.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I mean, I was the invisible woman. You know. Let's go to a question from Sage. I'm curious about the question of Indigenous youth being less interested in negotiation, reconciliation is dead, etc. And as a university student, I see the ways in which I negotiate every day to survive the institution. I'm much more interested in the concept of resistance. In what ways can or do older generations support Indigenous youth in continuing resistance? How can we have more intergenerational dialogue in the Indigenous diaspora? And yes, anybody want to jump in?
I think the supporting piece, right? I hope, I didn't look at the participant list, but I hope there's folks from all across Canada there. And, you know, it's about simply going and meeting with youth, right? So I'm thinking about in the education system in universities, right? There's typically Indigenous student groups and, you know, connecting with those groups. I did so when I was at the University of Manitoba. There's something that became very public with respect to the youth not being, the Indigenous youth not being invited to the table, right? And we have to mobilize together, right? And so it is happening. I remember the verdict that came out with Colton Bushy, and we mobilized across Canada within 24 hours across Canada and did a vigil and did marches, right? That's unheard of, right? You know, I think about, you know, people, you know, we were never idle. That's no slight to Idle No More, but I remember an elder saying, you know, we were never idle. So when Idle No More came out, there was a bit of a jarringness to folks who had marched to Ottawa in 1974. And, you know, we have to continue doing that work so we can learn from older generations and we can also learn from younger generations. And we do mobilize. We are doing it. It is happening. Everybody might not be aware of it, but there is, you know, there's a lot of stuff happening.
Yeah, I know a lot of the teach-ins continued after Idle. You know, there was the big January 13th, January 11th 2013 March from Idle No More after months of Idle No More, and it kind of went quiet, but it didn't stop. It just changed form into teach-ins and stuff, and people described it as a muscle that could be triggered any time. I think also for resistance, there was a point where I remember our elders for my generation saying, don't take up arms. There had been instances at Gustafson Lake and where both sides were armed, and they told us not to be violent and to do peaceful actions. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of been the pattern that we've been following. And you'll see in it all these, actions and resistance, that there's always youth there, there's always children there, it's mothers, it's families. Mm-hmm. I don't know, what other ways do we support Indigenous resistance for youth?
I think you said it, Karen, right? Like with APTN, and I think with Indigenous Resurgence, it's about creating opportunities for that next generation, like very specific opportunities. And Len mentioned this as well, right? So, in universities, we have almost every post-secondary institution now has an Aboriginal Student Services or an Indigenous Student Services. But so much more money needs to be put there in order to create programs that creates avenues for Indigenous people. And I talk about this being a colonial institution, right? And not everybody needs to get a degree from these colonial institutions, but with respect to the discipline that I'm in, social work, we have people doing work that is social in community, but yet they're gonna lose their job because they don't have that social work degree. So people wanna enter this colonial institution, but they should be able to enter the colonial institution and leave it 4 years later and be more healthy than when they entered. But oftentimes these colonial institutions break our Indigenous students down, right? And we have to focus on supporting Indigenous students. So the environment that you had as a young journalist with APTN, I think supported you, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we need to create more of those opportunities across all disciplines, across all areas. But I think the other piece is, we have to do things for ourselves, right? And without the support of government, right? We're bound to government funding with a lot of our nonprofit organizations, and they dictate what we have to do, how we can spend our money. So how do we break away from that? I opened up a lot there, but it goes back to the first question that was answered, like what resources do we need? If we continue to ask for resources from the colonial government, we're going to continue down that colonial path. So we have to resist.
So I'm gonna go to another question. It says, let me see who wrote this. I need to scroll up. Avi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Carolyn Bennett of the Crown Indigenous Relations said they're working on a national action plan, and it was supposed to be released June 3rd. And that's one that we now think is going to be delayed. Who's involved in creating this action plan, and what will this embody? And I don't know if we can really answer those questions. I've spoken to some of the families of MMIW, and I know they said that they have not heard anything and they felt left out. Does anybody know, is the government doing this on their own?
Do you hear that?
We haven't heard anything either, right?
You hear that? It's crickets, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Avi, I can't answer that question. It's whatever the government's been doing, they've been doing it without the participation that I know of Indigenous women leadership. I do think that they have reached out to NWAC, Native Women's Association of Canada, recently. I read that in a piece by Kathleen Martin, but that was a recent reach out. So what's been happening all this time? I wish I knew. This is something that I continue to follow Kathleen Martin's at APTN, because she's digging into this right now. There's a question from Gail Gallagher. Oh, hey, Gail. Gail's an old friend of mine. Discuss sexualized violence that Indigenous women experience. That's maybe a topic, that's a heavy topic, but it's one that's part of this conversation for sure. Anybody want to jump in? Yeah, Cyndy?
This is a lot of, again, the work that I'm involved in. So I've done some research around trafficking of Indigenous girls, and I'm continuing to do that. That's kind of like where my work is starting to get very focused. One of the things that I've learned from my research that I find fascinating, but also very disturbing, is that a lot of the girls have gotten into trafficking through actions of their actual families and communities. So, you know, back at some point we were talking about our own, patriarchy within our own communities. And, you know, Karen, you mentioned about the reporters and with the chiefs, et cetera, that kind of thing. So I think that this, for us as Indigenous peoples, as Indigenous women, as communities, this is something that we need to be tackling internally. I'm still kind of blown away by all of this, and I probably shouldn't be talking about it a whole lot publicly because that may not go over very well with people. But my whole thing about this is that, can you imagine how desperate people have to be in order to actually use their children in that kind of a way, right? So once again, it all connects back to colonization and the systemic injustices that are there. So that this is, unfortunately, this is a big one within our communities. You know, I wish it was that, you know, all of our girls were being recruited by strangers and that kind of a thing, right? And certainly that's happening a lot, but once again, it's not the complete story.
Well, you know, and we had Kenneth Jackson, who did a lot of work showing that there's a pipeline, or there was very much a pipeline going from child welfare straight into prostitution. And there's maybe, I mean, I don't want to deny that there is, you know, there are people who speak very positively about the sex trade and who've entered the sex trade and have entered it as adults and see it as a very feminist, wonderful thing, very empowering. And I don't want to deny that that exists. I'm sure it does, but that's not what we're seeing in our communities for the most part. And I think that really is an excellent point. And it is a lot of children out in Winnipeg on the streets. It is kids. These are people having sex with children. And beyond that, there's also the sexualized violence that takes place in relationships. I mean, I've been a victim of that, and I don't really like to talk about it. But when we've covered it and women have come forward, there's so much pushback. Like when we started, the Me Too movement came to us late. And when it came, there was a lot of pushback against it. I don't know if people have thoughts that they want to share on that.
I would just add that a general point, the gender lens is never irrelevant, and it is especially not irrelevant in colonial contexts. And if you look at resistance to the report, the question of the gender significance, the gender distribution of violence and vulnerability at the heart of the national inquiry is one of the things that is skirted around so conspicuously. The other point I would make is my partner Isabel has just finished a report on sexual violence in Saskatchewan with a number of collaborators. They presented the report about three or 4 weeks ago. And in that report, they take on the trope of the victim of sexualized violence as having a high risk lifestyle.
Yeah.
And that's an alibi, right? For the abandonment of those who are vulnerable to even more
Victim blaming.
And what they've tried to do in the report is to move the risk from the victim to the perpetrator, and to ask what kinds of social conditions, what kinds of social determinant, what kinds of desperation, to use another word for the point that Cyndy made, how low do people have to go before you have to ask them, how low can you go? Why did they get down there? And so trying to get to the conditions that make possible, and indeed prevalent in particular kinds of ways, pipelines and, for instance, into exploitation. So those are the two. The gender lens is never irrelevant, and the question of risk needs to be shifted from stigmatizing as they got what their lifestyle guaranteed them to get, into a broader consideration of the reproduction of the preconditions for sexualized male violence to women.
Okay. Lynn, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this?
No.
Okay, I'll go on to another question. So we are getting down to close time. So maybe actually, instead of going to another question, what I'll do, I just saw the clock. I can't believe how fast the time has gone. Maybe I'll just do a round of sort of closing thoughts to sort of wrap up what we've spoken about today. Cyndy, do you have closing thoughts you'd like to share?
It's just, I think all I would want to say is that it's important to continue to do these kinds of things. Again, this is another way of educating people and putting, things out there. So I think it's important to continue. I love the idea about doing a panel with some young people on a related topic. I think that would be pretty awesome. But I just think that for the rest of us, it's like, just continue, putting our responsibilities into practice. And that is a lot about supporting youth and helping them to be able to continue in whatever way they choose.
Thank you. And thank you for so many of the hopeful comments that you made today. I tend to be a little bit on the cynical side. So it's great to hear that hope. It's very inspiring. And Len, what do you want to wrap up with today?
Well, with apologies to Lynn, I'm going to use the word decolonize. And I'm going to suggest that the work at the moment is to decolonize the current crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. That crisis has given us a Rorschach, it's given us a picture of this country in the distribution of opportunity and respect and reward. And it is, in many ways, a deeply ugly picture. It is seriously in need of beautification. And the beautifiers are all around us, but they need to be respected in their diversity, and they need to be given resources. And one of the things that's happening at the moment is, whose money is it anyway? That is massive. Throw the neoliberal flinty hearts out the window. There's been a massive redistribution of resources. And I think that recognition that people are more important than money, that the money, if it is spread, gives hope, creates possibility, people can feed their kids, and then they can have a good conversation with their kids and empower them to do the things that they can do in making their contributions to their own lives and to society. So decolonize the crisis.
And thanks for that, Len. And it's so important, I think, to have you here and to have a voice from our allies, because really it shows how far we've come. We could not have had this conversation maybe 15, 20 years ago. So it's so great to just be able to be on the same page and to feel the support from allies. Lynn, well, how would you like to close out today?
Yeah, maybe I will go back to the comment about sexual violence and sex trade and the link to the topic that we're discussing today. And, for people to realize that there's a broad range of things going on, right? So Cyndy referred to, families and desperation and, you know, having their, basically pimping out their children, I think, right? Like not using that language. But, you know, I think I wouldn't want people to latch onto that and think that this is all related to sexuality or sexual violence, because that's also detracting us from the discussion about murdering Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and trans, right? So I haven't, like, I didn't prepare mentally to really dive deep in this, but I just want to make sure that people don't come away with with a reinforced stereotype, right? And the last comment, Skoden.
Fantastic. Skoden. So I think I'm supposed to turn it back over to Jim now. Are you there, Jim? He magically appears.
I am here. I want to thank Cyndy and Len and Lynn for a very stimulating discussion on some difficult issues. I thought you were very clear, and I thought you raised a lot of interest. And there were, I see, quite a number of questions that we weren't able to get to from the audience. So obviously it rang true to a lot of members of the audience. And I want to thank Karen for doing a wonderful job of moderating this panel discussion. I would like to remind everyone that this is the third of a series of 9 or 10 virtual panel discussions the Center for Free Expression is having in May and June. The next one is next week on Thursday at 2 p.m. And we'll be getting into have we gone too far in restricting speech. So it'll be a very controversial panel. So I hope that some of you will tune in for that one. Also, all of the events in this series are available on the Center for Free Expression website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca. If you click on events, it lists each of the upcoming events. So please have a look at that. And if you have any suggestions for future panel discussions that you would like to have and like us to arrange, you can send an email to cfe at cfe.ryerson.ca with any suggestions for panels, and we'd be glad to explore them. So once again, I really want to thank all of you for taking the time to be part of this discussion, and to the panel and to the moderator for a superb job. Thanks very much, everybody.